It's been a few weeks since I've been down here with you on the southern end. I was 2 weeks up north, and then this past weekend I was away for a wedding. So it's good to be back again. During that time, the homily series that I've been going through during this ordinary time on different cultural issues kind of finished going through different topics in the area of sexual morality. So if you missed some that you wanted to hear, some topics, you can find that through our website or Facebook pages. But certainly not all the issues that we deal with in our world today have to specifically fall within that category. And so today I want to open a different issue that's been talked a lot more about recently, but I find not usually from a Catholic perspective, as many of these aren't always. And that's the issue of racism. Racism is a real sin, but sometimes the word is thrown around so much today that being used for things like name-calling of people or to try to shut down conversations between people who disagree with things, that it seems that for many they kind of struggle to understand what it actually is and when it's present or when it's not. Well, from the church's point of view, racism arises when a person holds that his or her own race or ethnicity is superior and therefore judges persons of other races or ethnicities to be inferior or unworthy of equal regard. And so when that kind of conviction or attitude leads the individual or groups to exclude or ridicule or mistreat or unjustly discriminate against someone else based upon their race or ethnicity, then that is sinful. And historically, that kind of attitude of one group against another has been pretty much found through the course of every single century and across the globe throughout all of human history, since we're all fallen, sinful human beings. Now, so that means our country's history, too, isn't exempt from it. And we should have sorrow for recognizing certain past injustices that have been made, especially, say, against Native Americans, African Americans, but at the same time praising God that much of those have been rooted out, not only with the abolition of slavery, but also the important civil rights being upheld for all peoples. So the idea that racism is a sin is clearly also condemned in the scriptures as well. And even though we don't really find that term specifically mentioned there because it's more of modern origin. So when we look in the Bible, we find that even though the Jewish nation was kind of separated out from among all the other tribes as being God's chosen people, that was not in any way God saying that this group of people is better than all the others. It's not what he was teaching at all. In fact, it was rather that God was revealing himself first to the Jews so that he could later, through Jesus, bring all nations to come to know him. And so that's why we see Jesus in the Gospels engaging also not just with the Jews, but with the Gentiles. For example, he heals the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman. He gives the example of a good Samaritan for us to look at. And also in the Gospel today, he heals this deaf, mute man who's from the predominantly Greek area of the Decapolis. So Jesus commands his disciples to baptize all nations, all peoples. In the second reading we have today, St. James says that we're to show no partiality amongst each other. And even though his context in the reading today is specifically not to judge people against one another, thinking that some may be better because they're rich versus those that are poor, that this same terminology applies also to other ways in which we might judge one another, including race. And so the same term is used by St. Peter in the book of Acts. He says, God shows no partiality. Rather, in every nation, whoever fears him and acts uprightly is accepted to him. And that's really the biblical origin that we find of what Martin Luther King Jr. said, that all should not be judged by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character. St. Paul says a similar thing. He says, there's no partiality with God, meaning that at the end of life, God is not going to judge people based upon things like ethnicity or the way that we physically look, but rather he will judge us based upon whether we did good or evil, our character. So things like race or sex are not legitimate distinctions for excluding any human being from our great dignity. Paul says in Galatians, there's neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free person. There's neither male nor female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. And also the whole core of the gospel that I've been referring back to again and again through the series leads us to this as well. We have a common origin, that all human beings of every culture has been made in the image of God. We have a common fall. Every human being has inherited original sin. It says in Romans that death came to all insofar as all have sinned. But, praise God, we also have a common redemption. Salvation has been won for all by Jesus Christ. Through one righteous act, acquittal in life came to all, it says in Romans again. And then finally, we're made, all of us, for a common destiny, the eternal happiness of heaven. As we see this described in the book of Revelation, where there's the multitude of saints in heaven from every nation, race, people, and tongue. So racism really is a sin because it denies this Judeo-Christian account of human nature. And I don't draw our attention to this because I'm not assuming that there's somehow some kind of hidden racism behind all of us. But in fact, I'm pretty sure that for most of us, this is basically just a common belief that should guide us through everything. The dignity of every human person, no matter who they are. We know that we should recognize and treat everyone that we meet as our brother and sister. But because we also do sin against one another, it's good for us to consider, how is it that we do see and treat our brothers and sisters? How do we live out loving our neighbor? And as part of the church's self-reflection in this area, recently we've had some discussions amongst the clergy in the archdiocese, especially wanting to hear from some of our brother priests that come from minority backgrounds, wanting them to share their experiences. And beautifully, they've said that overall they feel very welcome by our priests and by our people in our archdiocese. That they don't feel the kind of oppression or hatred that some voices in the culture claim that they should. Of course, it doesn't mean that cultural differences amongst different people can sometimes lead people to even purposefully or doing insensitive things. Sometimes we can be jerks to each other at times. Or even doing things inadvertently that end up hurting one another. But in neither of those cases does it automatically mean that it's being done because of some kind of hidden racism behind it. So, for example, with the desire that all of our priests in our archdiocese be represented, the Priest Council had set up a category of foreign-born priests to make sure that they would be represented. But in now listening to some of our brothers, that distinction really actually makes them feel less included. As one of them said, I've been here so long now, when can I just be an Omaha priest? Sometimes, as parishioners, we might complain about cultural differences or language barriers. It's hard to understand Father's homily because of his accent. Well, we also need to consider, too, that, a priest, he wants to share the good news with his people, and many will work hard to try to make it themselves more understandable if they have an accent. But that can often mean that they have to change a part of who they are. That's something that's quite difficult and also a sacrifice and even a sorrow for them, because in a sense, they're having to give up a part of who they are in doing that. And all this applies not just to priests, but to anybody that we'd meet. Charity towards one another goes a long way, as well as just getting to know the other person, who may be at first perceived as being different from you. It can go a long way into seeing one another as brothers and sisters that we are. To think, do I see that person as a unique individual created by God, or do I judge that person according to some kind of preconceived idea of a group? So as I noted already, racism is really a more kind of modern term. It really wasn't a category within the minds of some of the great Catholic thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Alphonsus Liguori. And instead, in their writings, we find a kind of broader category of sin that from which racism can kind of arise. And it's the sin of rash judgment. Rash judgment. And I think that considering and thinking about rash judgment can help us better evaluate situations where maybe racism is claimed by some people, as well as reflect upon our own tendency at times to judge others, maybe based on things that we shouldn't judge them on. Areas that probably don't have anything at all to do with racism. So rash judgment, just very briefly, consists in making a conclusion about someone, questioning their character, without having sufficient evidence to do that. So for example, let's say, you happen to see somebody that you know, and they kind of walk right by you. They looked right at you, but they didn't say anything. They just kind of walk right by you. You're like, well, that's weird. Maybe they're angry at me. What's going on within them? And then you're thinking through what maybe they were thinking and leads you to be angry back towards them. Well, the reality is maybe that they were worried about something and they were just distracted. And even though they looked at you, they didn't even see you at all. And so now there's this division and anger that's been built up based upon nothing. That's a kind of rash judgment. There wasn't really a basis to come to that conclusion. Rash judgment doubts someone's goodness based upon slight indications. And so racism actually can be a form of rash judgment, judging the worth of another human being based upon an insufficient reason like the color of their skin or language or cultural habits. Because none of those things have any kind of bearing at all upon the worth of a person, because we're all created with great dignity in God's image. So if someone rashly judges someone else in that way, or denies their due because of those kind of ethnic or racial identities, then it becomes the sin of racism. Though there's various other ways in which we might judge others rashly. And so next week, I want to further consider rash judgment in its different forms and how to work against that temptation to judge one another. I think it's especially important in the kind of age that we live in now with entertainment news and social media, where it's so easy, where people just are making so many rash judgments about one another. It's really a big problem. And then the following week, too, I want to hopefully help critique some of the race theory ideas that don't really fit in with Catholic thought, that rather end up causing greater harm than good. Traditionally, the church really didn't speak much about races, since the truth is, there's only one race, the human race. All of mankind has equal dignity. As the Catechism says, created in the image of the one God and equally endowed with rational souls, all men have the same nature and the same origin. Redeemed by the sacrifice of Christ, all are called to participate in the same divine beatitude. All, therefore, enjoy equal dignity.